Good morning, and I'm Sue Rose, and welcome. Early in the morning, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'm not, but I'll try to wake up as we go along. I'm Sue Rose, and I'm the coordinator of, I like to say I'm the head of the Deaf Education Program here at the University of Minnesota. I'm the head because there isn't anybody else there. I'm the only faculty member in the Deaf Hard of Hearing program, which is kind of an indicator of the incidence of hearing loss among young children. It's what we consider a low incidence hearing loss. We have an interpreter here this morning. Actually, we have two interpreters with us this morning because we will have a deaf participant joining us in a short time. As soon as she arrives, she'll be sitting in the group and then joining us in our conversations. And in the second half of the presentation, she'll be talking to you about her experiences, and we'll give you a little background later on. In a way of introduction, I'd like to give you my background so you know some of my biases, and also so you know what I don't know, and areas that you're going to have to fill in and make assumptions about, and perhaps ask each other questions about how you would handle very specific situations. I started out as a speech and language pathologist. In my early years were working at the Woods, Wisconsin Hospital, Veterans Administration Hospital in Wisconsin, right outside of Milwaukee, working with esophageal speech. After a short time, it was relatively, routine, and it just wasn't really exciting for me. So I got a call to come and work with at a school for the deaf and teach speech at a school for the deaf, which I was just totally thrilled with. And I ran over to the school for the deaf and started my first week on speech, and I was going to save the deaf children. I'm going to teach them how to talk so they could interact with the world. And of course, that quickly changed when we had just this huge number of students coming in at very young ages, 2.5, 3, 4 years of age, as a result of the rubella epidemic. Rubella was, of course, very widespread, and children with hearing loss and other disabilities were entering the schools in large, large numbers. So they took the speech and language pathologists and put us all in the classroom and said, we need teachers. We need people to teach kids every day. Last thing in the world I wanted to do was teach. I never wanted to be in a classroom. And here I am, in a classroom, loving every single day. I just absolutely loved being a teacher. The kids were teaching me. I knew nothing about teaching. So I slowly went back to school, went to Gallaudet to get my deaf education training, and then somebody said, don't go to Gallaudet. They all sign there. You need to go to a place that's oral, So I did. I ran off to University of Kansas, which was an oral auditory program only, and got my training in deaf education there and auditory oral training, and got my master's, went back to teach at the school that I was at previously, and later went on to the National Technical Institute for the Deaf and went back to teaching in speech and hearing sciences. Took on the role of educational interpreter because we were just trying out interpreting services at that time. We're kind of inventing interpreting. This is before the Registry of Interpreters or anything like that was developed. And after I left NTID, I was there for about 10 years, nearly 10 years. I went back for my PhD, and after I finished my PhD at Ohio State, I went to work for the mental health system in the state of Ohio, and I worked at the state hospital, mental health hospital. We had deaf and hard of hearing adolescents, young adults scattered throughout the mental health system, all throughout the state, in hospitals, in residential facilities that were going without treatment. And so we brought all of those clients together and over to the state hospital and set up a unit for deaf clients only, mainly for adolescents and young adults, because we felt that's the area that we could make the biggest impact. And so I stayed with that program for several years and then went to work in administration in the state, and then returned to Ohio State to really do teacher training with multiply disabled and deaf individuals. And then I came here to the University of Minnesota, where I've been for 20 years, for the last 20 years. I think we've been doing this for about 10 years at least, if not a few more years. So that's kind of my background. So you know that I'm coming from a very auditory oral approach as well as a sign-based approach. And I've worked with children and adolescents and young adults. And to this day, I can honestly say I know less about deafness and less about hearing loss than I did that first day I walked in the classroom. It's an area that is absolutely thrilling to me. And it's exciting and it keeps me motivated. Even though I'm in the end of my career, I still feel like there is so much to learn and there's so much to do. And the issues are the same. They keep popping up over and over again. And we just don't seem to find the answers. It's an extremely challenging field. And so my job today is to talk to you a little bit about what I don't know and what problems that need to be resolved in the future. And then to tell you some of the experiences I've had and how those experiences can relate to your work in the future and your work with deaf and hard of hearing children. Now, as I understand it, most of you will be working in public schools, public communities, public health nursing, or in clinical. Which areas will you be? Pretty much clinical, pretty many clinical practices. And you will run into deaf people or people with hearing loss, at least with hearing loss. But what I'm going to start off with and talk about in the first part of this presentation is really about hearing. Because none of us really understand hearing loss until it happens to us, until it actually occurs to us, not to somebody else, but to us. And then once we experience it, our whole perspective changes, and it's very difficult to describe to somebody else. So we can simulate a hearing loss, but it's not a hearing loss. So we're going to talk a lot more about hearing than we are about deafness or about a hearing loss, and what hearing does for us. And once you stop and think about it, you'll have a better understanding of what that individual who has a hearing loss is experiencing. If you first understand what hearing does and what hearing means to you. Every day we take our hearing for granted. Now, how many of you have worked with a hearing or hard of hearing or deaf person? You have? Do you have hearing loss in your family? Anybody have hearing loss? What's your experience with hearing loss? Here's Lauren. I'll introduce you after a while. Okay.
My uncle was deaf.
Your uncle was deaf. Was he born deaf or did he become deaf later?
Became
deaf. Anybody else? Mm-hmm.
My cousin's daughter had bacterial meningitis.
Ah.
As an infant, so now she has cochlear implant.
She had bacterial meningitis and as an infant, and then she had a cochlear implant. How old is she now?
She is just starting first grade, so her teacher is wired for her in the class.
Okay. With the FM units. Anybody else have experience with deafness or deafness in the family? All of you will probably have your parents or your grandparents losing their hearing. It's just a natural fact of life. So we're going to talk a little bit about hearing and look at what hearing really means. And hearing alone is purely a sensory mechanism. It's just simply a sensory input system that affects listening and therefore affects communication. The real impact of a hearing loss is not hearing. I know that each and every one of you love quiet, peace and quiet at certain points of the day. When you're sleeping, when you're kind of trying to study, think about things, there's a sense of relief when it's quiet. If you practice yoga, you want to have some peace and quiet. So all of us appreciate not having to listen, not having to communicate at certain points in the day. There's a time when we don't want to listen, and we really block things out purposefully. You know, the kids walking around with iPods, and huge, very loud music, are really telling us they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear. That's a way of blocking out everything else. So all of us want to stop listening at certain points in time, but we never can. We really look at what's around us 24 hours a day. Hearing is an awareness of sound. That sound is around, that we can perceive sound. We know sound is coming in, and that we anticipate that sound will occur. In other words, if I have a book in my hand, usually I do, have a book in my hand, or if I took this pot and I smash it to the ground, you anticipate that there will be sound in the environment. You can anticipate that when the baby screws up its face and opens up its mouth and goes, you can anticipate that there will be a sound coming out. How strange it would be if there weren't any sounds in our environment. How very strange it would be if we didn't have sound as a signal in our environment. Did you ever experience walking across a street and not hearing a car come up behind you? Or almost hit you, and you look around and all of a sudden you see it there, you didn't know it was going to be there? Did you ever anticipate a person coming up behind you, you didn't hear them, or there's so much noise around that you didn't know they were there, and all of a sudden they tap your shoulder and you jump through the roof? That happens. So sound, hearing, helps you to anticipate things in the environment. Through experiences, you know that things are happening. Listening is different than hearing. Okay. Listening is a perceptual cognitive activity. It is not a sensory activity. Listening is the attachment of sound to symbols. It gives it meaning. You receive information and you decide whether it's important. You decide whether you want to tune into it. You decide whether you really want to know about that sound. So listening is distinctively different from hearing. And that's very important for us and for communication. Communication is a two-way street. Communication takes two people or two entities. It could be a computer, it could be telephone. It doesn't always have to be somebody. Today, with the computers and email, communication is much more static. I mean, we can send a message, we can wait, and then we get something back. But there's a sender and a receiver. So it has to be two ends. There's another word we want to define before we really think about impact of hearing loss and also sound, communication, listening, and hearing, and that's language. Language is not speech. Language is a code. Okay? So speech is something that occurs as a surface, but language is a code of communication. It's a set of symbols that are used to communicate. It makes communication much more efficient when we use symbols rather than gestures. We can communicate over long distances when we use symbols. Language is a code that's embedded cognitively. It's not a sensory process, it's not a perceptual process, it's a cognitive process. So it's embedded cognitively in our system. And every child is born with the innate need to communicate and to use language in some way, shape, or form. And that's a very, very important concept to remember when we're talking about children with hearing loss. When you think about hearing loss, think about what you do during a given day. You listen for almost half of your day. You talk for a very, very large portion of the day. You read and write for a lesser portion of the day. But almost half of your day, half of your 24-hour day is spent listening. Not hearing, listening. Deciding whether something is important, decoding it and storing it in your brain to decide whether you should respond, react, or ignore. There are a lot of misconceptions about hearing, and the first is that listening and speaking depend on intelligence. I can teach a parrot to talk. I can teach my dog to listen to commands. My dog knows its name. But then I was taking care of my neighbor's dog, and I kept calling my neighbor's dog by my dog's name. Instead of Buddy, I called him Shadow, and Shadow would come. So dogs aren't quite as intelligent as we give them credit for, but they certainly have listening skills. They hear sound, they sift through it, and decide whether they want to respond or not. Sit, come, go, they respond to symbols. So dogs are really capable of listening. Much more than hearing, it's a higher level of cognitive activity. It's listening and responding selectively. Not very selective, but selectively. We also have a misconception that listening ability is closely related to hearing acuity. Well, listening is enhanced, but there are other ways. We can take a simple phrase such as, Okay. What did I just say? Very good! And you didn't even have to speech read it, right? You just kind of heard a pattern. So you don't, in familiar patterns or ritualistic patterns, you can hear just the surface. Somebody can kind of mumble your name in the background, and all of a sudden you kind of tune in, think, oh, I better listen to this because it sounds like they're talking about me. And in fact, it wasn't Sue, it was Hugh that they were talking about. Then you kind of ignore it, Listening training is unnecessary. We have to learn to listen. We have to sort out what we're listening to. A lot of autistic children are children who have not learned to listen. Many autistic children will listen, in quotes, to everything. And a lot of kids with learning disabilities have the same problem. They can't sort out the figure from the ground. So everything that they hear becomes equally as important. So when I'm hearing that sound above me, and I'm hearing that high frequency back there on the recorder, and I'm hearing rattling in the room, there isn't much rattling in the room. If there were noise out in the hall, I'm hearing all of those. I've learned to block those sounds out and not to pay attention to them, but I learn to hone in on what's important to me. That's training. That takes training to do that. We learn that in infancy. We learn that when a particular sound is made in the nursery, or mom is coming up saying, I'm coming, and the baby learns that mom's voice is soothing and will provide us with warmth and comfort or getting picked up. So we can talk to the babies and they learn to use specific cues. That's listening training. Listening training is very, very necessary. There's a myth that we're born to listen. We're born to hear, not to listen. So we learn to listen to things in the environment. The other is that improved reading ability will improve with listening ability. It's not as much listening as it is decoding. It's learning the language that we have around us will improve our reading ability. It will also improve our IQ. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit and some of the research that's been done. But all of this leads up to what is hearing. Okay, so that's just some background information, some information we've talked about in terms of hearing and what hearing is in terms of definitions. So we've put some definitions on the side. We know a little bit more now about hearing as a sensory process, listening is a perceptual cognitive process. Language is a coding system. That's very different than speech. Okay, speech is a mode of communication. It's a way of communicating. So we have some definitions now. So let's talk about hearing and what hearing allows us to do. Now I want you to think a little bit about how you got up this morning. How did you wake up this morning? Alarm clock. Whoops. An alarm clock. Absolutely. My alarm clock went off too early today, you know. But an alarm clock gets us up. That's sound. That means we used our hearing to wake up. But you were sleeping. Your hearing was operating while you were sleeping. Isn't that amazing? That your hearing was operating while you were sleeping? Our hearing system operates 24 hours a day. It's amazing. Even while you're sleeping, your hearing is operational. If you're a mother, you know that your hearing operates 24 hours a day. You can be in a very sound sleep and the baby cries and up you are. Okay. As an adolescent, you knew your parents, even in the middle of a sound sleep, knew when you were coming home. They'd always know. You know. So your hearing operates 24 hours a day. It never stops. What about vision? What about your vision? Did you see the alarm clock to tell you that it's time to get up? Okay. Did you see the baby cry to tell you it's time to get up? No. To take care of the baby? Your vision operates only while your eyes are functional. They're open. So every time you blink, you may be missing something. You better not blink because it may have passed by. Okay. Every time you give your eyes a rest, you reduce the amount of information you're taking in from the environment. But your hearing never stops. It continues 24 hours a day for 360 degrees. Okay. Your hearing is taking in information all around you. Okay. You know that somebody came in earlier in the class. Lauren came in earlier in the class because you heard the door open. You didn't see her walk in unless you were sitting there. You didn't see her walk in, but you heard the door open. Okay? That's information that was beyond your visual field is coming to you through your sense of hearing. So your sense of hearing is taking in information 24 hours a day, 360 degrees. Visually, you're taking in information at about, we'll say 180 degrees. That's fudging a little bit, but it's probably 120 degrees. But you're taking in information this far. But hearing, I'm taking information in at 360 degrees. I know a car is coming from behind me because my sense of hearing warns me. I know somebody is walking up behind me and dragging their feet or coughing on me because I can hear them. Our hearing operates beyond visual barriers. I can hear somebody in the hallway. I can hear somebody crying for help down the hall. or I can hear a plane going overhead, even though I couldn't see it. So our hearing operates beyond visual barriers. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. And our hearing operates at a rate 80 to 100 items per second. It is faster than any known computer today. We take in 80 to 100 bits of information, units of information per second through our hearing. Now, if we tried to attend to all of those pieces, we would go absolutely crazy. We'd just be bonkers. You can imagine how much information we're receiving. Okay. If you go into an anechoic chamber, that's a room where they've cut out all external sound. There are very few anechoic chambers in the country because they don't use them much anymore. They can use very small units. There used to be a lot more that they used to develop hearing aids and sound-sensitive equipment, earthquake sensors, different kinds of sound-sensitive equipment. They'd use an anechoic chamber. It's a room that you walk into and you're actually suspended in the spatial feature, in the spatial room, and they have huge cones that absorb sound. You probably, our sound man here probably knows a lot about that, but it absorbs sound from the environment, so it's perfectly silent. And when you walk into that room, all you can hear is the sound that you produce. And believe me, we are very, very noisy individuals. You can hear your heartbeat. You can hear the fluids through your body, functioning through your body. You can hear your teeth grinding, your tongue moving. We hear that every single day. You hear that when you're sleeping. You hear that sound, but we don't pay attention to it because it's meaningless to us. So we're going to try that right now. Take your fingers, and don't put your fingers in your ears. That's not a good thing to do. But just put them on your ear tabs and fold your ear tabs back over your auditory canal. Just fold them backwards, okay? And now say hi. Hi, how are you? Now, if you can hear me, raise your hand. You couldn't. How could you hear me? Your ears are closed. Okay? Now I want you to close your eyes. Okay? Close your eyes. Okay. If you can see me, raise your hand. Okay, you can open your eyes. Why could you hear, even when your ears are closed, but you couldn't see when your eyes were closed? Why? Take a guess. Take a wild guess. There's still some type of conduction going on. Perfect. What kind of conduction do you think is going on? Think about when you put your headsets on your chin. Pardon me? Bones. Exactly. I couldn't tell where that was coming from. It was your bones. It's bone conduction. Take your iPod. And the iPods aren't quite as good because the earplugs are not as large. But if you have a headset, like he has a headset on, or if you have a little larger earpiece, just put it on your jawbone or your shoulder bone. If you're a runner, you probably have seen in runners' magazines the Bonophones. It's a radio that you wear around your shoulders. And so you just wear it around your neck, and you can listen to the radio while you're running, and you hear it through your bones. Okay. So just try it sometime. Take a little earpiece and put it on the bone here, put it on the jaw, put it right in the middle, and it'll go to to both ears, rather than discriminate between right and left. So just try it out sometime. It's really, really interesting because a lot of sound is conducted through our bones. So air conduction, or sound coming through the air, is not able to enter our ears through the auditory canal, but we can still hear. That's how critical sound is to our survival, to our communication system, is that we can hear 24 hours a day. We take in information 360 degrees around us, beyond visual barriers, at a rate that's almost imperceivable in reproducing. The computer systems are trying to replicate the rate at which our hearing system can process information. It's just incredible. It's just incredible. Hearing